Welcome to the history of the video gaming industry, part 1. This is kind of a slideshow documentary I put together, and it's unscripted, so I'll just be going along with the pictures. So, video games were originally founded in 1972 by Ralph Baer, who was, I believe he was I don't know if he was an electrician or engineer, but he came up with the idea of the brown box prototype, which he created there, and it was basically just a couple square dots on a screen that moved around. He sold the idea to Magnavox, and they created the Magnavox Odyssey, which was released in September of 1972. And as you can see, it was really the most basic when it comes to video games. And he had two controllers here that just had an analog stick on it, and the games were just circuit boards. They didn't have plastic shells or anything, and pretty much every game was the same. There were square balls on the screen, but the different circuit boards gave different variations, and instead of graphics they had plastic overlays that you put over the TV screen. And it also came with other items such as dice, you had poker chips, you had cards, for football games. There was even a football field that came with it, so a lot of kind of unique things to make it a game. This here is Nolan Bushnell. Now, he worked at an amusement park for many years, and this is while he was going to college as an engineer, and he saw how people were playing games at an amusement park, how they spent so much money on it. And that's when he had the idea that he could come up with video games. And he had seen the Magnavox Odyssey, and he liked the idea, but he didn't think it was designed very well, so he decided to make a better version of that. He founded Atari along with his friend Ted Dabney, and together they hired Alan Alcorn, who was given the project to design an arcade game based off the Magnavox Odyssey's tennis game. And here they came up with Pong, and it turned out to be really successful. Just batting a ball back and forth. And it was so successful that one time they thought the machine broke down, the bar that had it, and they called him in. When they checked it out, it turned out it was just overflowing with coins. So Alan Alcorn realized all he had to do was empty the coin box, but it became pretty popular, so they mass produced it and distributed it all over the place. And then they decided to make it into a home Pong console, so you could hook it to your TV and play right at home. And it became so popular, there were tons of other companies that started making their own Pong consoles. So there was just tons of Pong consoles out there between like 1972 to 76. In 1974, I believe, Steve Jobs ended up getting hired with Atari. His first job before, kind of his first job in the electronic era. And the people didn't like him at Atari because he stunk and he really had an attitude. So Nolan Bushnell put him on the night shift, which they didn't have at the time, so he was the first one on the night shift, which is where he worked designing games for Atari, arcade games, and I think they're still doing Pong consoles at the time, but they're mostly also doing arcade games. And while working at Atari, Steve Jobs had a friend named Steve Wozniak who used to work for Hewlett-Packard. When Steve Wozniak got off work, he would stop over at Atari to hang out with his friend Steve Jobs, and together they would work on these projects for Atari. And Atari founder Nolan Bushnell liked it. He said he felt he was getting 2 Steves for the price of 1. Then in 1976, Nolan Bushnell came up with this idea to create a home console where you could switch the games, and unfortunately Atari did not have the money capable of mass producing something like this, so they sold to Warner Communications. So Warner would become the parent company of Atari. Nolan Bushnell would remain the CEO of Atari, and this would give them the money they needed to produce this console. In 1977, Nolan Bushnell also founded Chuck E. Cheese, because at the time most arcade games were only found in pool halls and bars. But Nolan Bushnell knew that video games would be real popular with kids, so he wanted to create a place where kids could go and be introduced to these video games. And Chuck E. Cheese was the best idea because it's a pizza place, so you can go there as a family, and while the kids are waiting for their pizza to cook, they could be playing these arcade games. On September 11th, 1977, the Atari Video Computer System was released, later known as the 2600, and it was a really huge success. It just started out small and just skyrocketed. This is the first console where you could actually switch completely games, other than the Magnavox Odyssey, which was kind of primitive for the time. But I mean, this had like full cartridges that were full games that were different. In 1978, Warner Communications COO Manny Gerard and Atari's CEO Nolan Bushnell were always arguing. One time they had a really big fight, and Manny Gerard told Nolan Bushnell, "You're fired." Bushnell said, "Nope, I quit." So Bushnell was no longer with Atari. He decided to put all of his focus on Chuck E. Cheese at the time. And then Atari went and hired Ray Kassar to be the new CEO of Atari. And in 1979, the video game designers for Atari were starting to realize how much money Atari was making off their games, and they wanted to be treated like rock stars. For example, when Elvis released a record, his name would be on there, and he'd also get a lot of money for it. And as video game designers, they felt they should be treated the same way. They wanted their name to be on these games, and they wanted to get much more pay for it. But Ray Kassar didn't feel the same way. He told him no. So you got 4 people, these 4 designers right here. You've got Bob Whitehead, Alan Miller, Larry Kaplan, and David Crane. They had all quit Atari and started their own company called Activision. And with Activision, they began creating their own Atari games. And see, since video games were fairly new at the time, Atari didn't have any copyrights on anything, so anybody was pretty much open to make any games they wanted for the Atari. And I know it's kind of hard to imagine, but when you think of like VCRs or CD players, you might have like a Magnavox CD player that plays Sony CDs. That's kind of how video games were back at the time. Then in 1980, Mattel released the Intellivision. And pretty much just another console similar to Atari, played video games. By 1982, Atari was worth $2 billion, and they made headlines being known as the fastest growing company in American history. From 1977 to 1982, they just skyrocketed. And other companies began to see this, and they decided they were going to start making games for the Atari 2600. So you got all these companies out there starting to make games. I mean, Activision was the first third-party company to start making games, but then you've got like Sears, JCPenney, you've got companies such as Nintendo, Sega, Konami, even the Purina dog food company had all these random companies making games for the Atari, and a lot of these companies didn't have the skilled developers or designers that Atari and Activision had. So there were just so many games out there that were terrible. And I mean, when I say so many, we're talking a lot and a lot. It got to the point where there were probably more bad games than there were good games. And to make matters worse, video game stores were having a hard time keeping up with them, because let's say a video game store gets 100 games in this month and they sell 50% of those. Next month they get 100 new games in. Well, now they got these 50 games that they didn't sell last month. They have to take all those games down to make room for the new games, and they end up putting all those old games in bargain bins. And I mean, this just got to be kind of a repeated thing. These bargain bins are going to end up filling up fast. They're going to have to get more bargain bins. So stores were starting to lose money on video games because people were starting to lose interest in them because there were so many terrible games. And there was really no way to know whether a game was good or not back then, except for mouth of word, or word of mouth. But in 1980, the biggest arcade game was Pac-Man. And even Atari made some mistakes of their own back then. So when I said there were a lot of bad games out there, it wasn't just these companies with unskilled designers, but even these big companies like Atari made some mistakes. And one of them was they wanted to make a Pac-Man game on the Atari VCS. So they had designer Todd Fry design the game, and he did the best he could with what limited technology he had to work with, because trying to put a video game, like an arcade game, onto a home console was really hard work, especially when it's like a really popular one. But he ended up doing it the best he could, and Atari was so confident that their Pac-Man game was going to sell that they created 12 million cartridges when at that point they only sold 10 million consoles. Atari was so confident that Pac-Man was going to be a hit on their console that it would end up selling Atari consoles. Now, while Pac-Man was the #1 selling Atari game, selling 7 million, that's still kind of a far shot from 12 million. That gave Atari 5 million cartridges that they couldn't sell. So that's 5 million cartridges they had to put in a warehouse, just sitting there collecting dust. And this is what Atari looked like on the 2600. Ghost flickered. I mean, me personally, this is the first video game I'd ever played. I'd never played the arcade version, so I didn't really think this game was that bad, but I mean, when you've played the arcade version of something first and then you play a worse version, you're just not going to like it. Then also in 1982, the movie E.T. came out. It was a really huge success. It had been the #1 movie for years to come after that. And once again, Atari decided, let's make a game out of it. This time they asked Howard Scott Warshaw. CEO Ray Kassar asked Howard Scott Warshaw if he can make this E.T. game. But the only problem was they wanted to get it sold by Christmas time. So in order to get this game created and coded and marketed and sold, Howard Scott Warshaw would only have 5.5 weeks to work on it. Ray Kassar asked him if he could do it in 5.5 weeks, and he told him yes, because he wanted to be impressive. So Warner Communications went and paid something like $25 million, I think it was. Maybe it was $26 million to Steven Spielberg to get the rights to make the E.T. game. That's a picture of Steven Spielberg with game designer Howard Scott Warshaw. And here is the E.T. game that was released by Christmas. He was able to get it done in 5.5 weeks. And it was released, and they made 4 million copies it sold, but people did not like the game. It was too frustrating. You had to read the instructions to figure out what to do. There were actually people returning the game. They wanted their money back. So it was a flop. This game would go on for years to be known as the worst video game of all time. But I personally think it was just the fact that the movie was so big that the game was expected to be as big, and it wasn't. I think the disappointment was just what made people call it the worst video game of all time. Because I've played games on like NES that were just as frustrating, if not more frustrating, than E.T. E.T. was the very first game I'd ever beaten as a kid. And I mean, yeah, I admit it was frustrating, but I mean, not as frustrating as some of the games on the NES. Another thing going on in 1982 was Apple computers. Apple II was released, and back then home computers were like $1,000, but when the Apple II came out, they dropped the price down to like $500, making them a lot more affordable. So people were starting to buy home computers, and with these home computers you could play video games on them that were, the graphics looked much better than the Atari version of the games. And not only that, but they weren't just for video games, they had other uses, like where you could store information on them. So by this time the video gaming industry is really struggling. You've got, you know, people not buying games anymore because of games being terrible, and you had stores getting sick of games because they were throwing them in bargain bins, losing money on them, you know. And then you got people buying computers, which is another reason why people don't want to buy plastic games for consoles. And also, I forgot to throw in a picture here, the ColecoVision was released in December of '82, which was another competitor of Atari. And then the Coleco had an add-on for their console which played Atari games. And then there was the Coleco Gemini, which was a complete clone of the Atari 2600, just looked different, but I mean the inside workings was a clone. So I mean the video gaming industry was getting a little out of control towards the end of '92. There's just a look at popular computer game, the Oregon Trail. So by 1983, throughout the year of 1983, we had what is now known as the video game collapse. 1983, and some of these companies like Mattel and Coleco had something to fall back on because they were originally toy companies that got into video games, so they could go back to making toys. Mattel go back to making whatever toys they made, and Coleco had just come out with Cabbage Patch Kids, which turned out to be a huge success, so that kind of helped them during the video game crash. But Atari really didn't have anything to fall back on. They started out making video games, and now nobody's buying these games. Atari reported that they lost $536 million throughout the year of 1983. And people were just getting laid off one by one. And sometime during the summer of '83, I think I might have said 93 before, but if I did I meant 83. Sometime during the summer of '83, CEO Ray Kassar had ended up leaving Atari. I'm not sure if he got fired or if he quit, but apparently he was accused of selling stocks right before the announcement of the video gaming problems or the losses that Warner Communications were going through. So he ended up leaving, and many of the designers and employees of Atari were getting laid off one by one. And then in the fall of 1983, a newspaper reported that Atari spent a week taking truckloads of video games to a desert in Alamogordo, New Mexico, burying them in a landfill, and Atari denied this dump ever took place, so for years it would be a mystery. Was it real? Was it a myth? Nobody really knew at the time. Meanwhile, while the video game crash was going on in North America, you had Nintendo of Japan, who was having success with video games, releasing arcade games, and they had also developed and published a few games for the Atari 2600 and for Coleco. They actually worked with Coleco on the game Donkey Kong, which was released in 1980, and they were having more success in Japan than the companies were in North America. And Nintendo released the Famicom, which is short for the Family Computer, and this had far more success than any other video game console at the time. And when you compare this to the Atari 2600 games, these games were far superior. And Nintendo knew that they could make this work in North America. It was just a matter of how. They wanted to bring back the video gaming industry because they saw how much money companies were making in North America. They knew that if it was done right, they could repeat that. So it was 2 years later, in 1985, they came up with some ideas. They redesigned the Famicom so it didn't look like a video game console. They wanted to keep the name video games as far away from this thing as possible. It was called the Nintendo Entertainment System, and back in 1985, one thing that was very popular in North America were VCRs. So they gave this design look more like VCRs, where you stick the games in and they go down. And the games weren't even called video games, they were called game packs at the time. So that was the first step, the design of the console. Another thing that was very popular at the time in North America were robots. So Nintendo came up with this idea to create Rob the Robot, which would be sold with the NES, and it would be compatible with two games, Gyromite and Stack Up. So the only thing Nintendo wanted to do was to get this game, or to get this console, into people's homes. Once they did that, people would buy games. So that was the main goal, just get people to buy the console first. So anyway, Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa took him and his group of employees from Nintendo of America, went to these stores in New York trying to sell the stuff, and a lot of people weren't interested. A lot of store owners, they just didn't want anything to do with it. But Minoru Arakawa gave them his personal guarantee that they will buy back every console that they don't sell. Well, the stores really didn't have much to lose, but another problem is they don't want to spend all their time paying their employees to set the stuff up. So Nintendo of America volunteered to set the stuff up for them. So you got these workers at Nintendo of America. You had, like, there was Howard Phillips, Gail Tilden, and there were many interviews with these people where they talked about this long process of setting all this stuff up. But they were working double shifts. They would go into these stores during the nights, setting all these displays up, and, you know, Rob the Robot and the NES and everything. And then during the daytime shift, they're trying to introduce all this stuff to the customers and trying to get them to play it. And throughout all that hard work, it ended up working. People started buying the NES. Some of the things that Nintendo did different than Atari was they put a lockout chip inside. This would prevent unlicensed games. So just random companies out there couldn't just make games for the NES. If you wanted to make an NES game, you had to go through Nintendo. So Nintendo really put some strict rules down, and there were a lot of people that were complaining about Nintendo doing this, but I mean, in a way it was necessary to prevent another video game crash. So these are some of the third-party companies you might have seen. You got Hudson Soft, you see Tecmo, HAL Laboratories, you got Capcom, you got SNK, Ultra Games, Acclaim, you got LJN, Data East, Taito, Activision, Konami. I mean, there were others out there. I just kind of made a collage of some of the ones that I remember the most. But Nintendo also set down some rules that these companies are only allowed to create 5 games a year, and Nintendo would review these games first for releasing, and if Nintendo was happy with what they saw, then it would be able to be played on the NES. Now, Nintendo also recognized that a company like Konami had a lot of successful games, so they kind of found a loophole for them where they can create a secondary name such as Ultra Games. So you'll see a lot of games out there by Konami and Ultra Games that were all made by Konami. So this way Konami could actually release 10 games a year under 2 different names. With the video game industry starting to boom again in North America, Atari decided to release the Atari 7800. This was originally created in 1984, but they decided not to release it at the time because of the video game crash. 2 years later, they released it. And you've got the Sega Master System, which was released in September of 1986. And Nintendo would end up going on to sell 61 million consoles. Atari would go on to sell 3 million, and the Sega Master System only sold 13 million. So Nintendo was dominating the video gaming industry by 1988. And actually, I guess I should say by the beginning of 1989. So that was part 1 of my video gaming industry documentary. Most of the information I got was from interviews with like people such as Howard Phillips, Gail Tilden, Nolan Bushnell, Howard Scott Warshaw, people like that. You know, I also got some information, mostly like the numbers, like the 61 million consoles, 3 million, 13 million. I got some of that information I got off Wikipedia, so I mean, there might be some information that I'm not 100% accurate on, but decided to do my best and getting it as accurate as I can. So that was part 1. Next week we'll see part 2, which will be more about the 4th generation consoles, where you had Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis competing, and a bunch of other companies that were jumping in there. So hope you enjoyed that. See you in the next video.